an overview of why we came up with this project and where it's currently at, and towards the end, what are current challenges we're facing within it. So the background for this bug bounty program is I think there's good evidence for a ubiquity of errors in research, and errors is something we should expect in research. And some of these errors in science had pretty devastating impacts on practice or policy. And I'll give you a few examples. So I think this is probably one of the most famous ones. If you know it, bear with me. I have some more, which I hope you might not have heard of yet. So in 2010, two economists, Reinhardt and Rogoff, published a very influential paper showing or demonstrating, allegedly, a negative relationship between national debt and economic growth. And this became a highly cited paper in academia, but it also became very influential in the political sphere, and it influenced European austerity policies, for example, in Greece and Ireland. Basically, the idea was if you reduce the national debt below a certain threshold, the economy will flourish. And supposedly this was in effect demonstrated across various economies, except when in 2013 a grad student, Thomas Herndon, discovered that they added up the wrong cells in an Excel sheet. And if you do it correctly, the relationship disappears. 2016, totally different area. In data from genetic research, for example, homology maps are often shared in Excel files. And this is a very cool paper because basically what they did is they scanned gene lists from 3,500 papers for unknown gene codes. And 20% of these files have a date error. And I'm sure if you have used Excel ever, you are familiar with the date error. Basically, Excel has an algorithm that automatically detects when it thinks you're entering a date, and then it reformats this to whatever preferred date format exists in your wherever your localization of Excel, basically. And it does so with a certain number of gene codes, which is something that was known already since 2004. Except this paper is from 2016, and it just keeps persisting. And the problem is, of course, different codes can lead to the same date, so we can't reverse engineer it either. So basically, these information are lost. Uh, I swear this is not an Excel hate talk, but does anyone here know how this one got resolved? I think it's quite funny. Yeah, they they renamed human genes because the idea that Excel could change this rule or this algorithm was so absurd that they literally went and changed the codes for genes that caused this problem, which I think is an incredible workaround if you think about it, like the coordination this requires. Um, anyway. 2025, another paper that has not been that influential yet, but has made quite a splash in the press about nanoplastics accumulating in the human brain. And shortly after it was published, someone on Papier noticed a weird image duplication in the paper, which was then corrected, but also the authors say it did not affect the main conclusions. More interestingly, a few months after this paper came out, another paper came out showing that the gas chromatography mass spectrometry used in 16 out of 18 of these micro or nanoplastic studies between 2022 and 2024, including that one in 2025, cannot actually distinguish between plastics and lipids, which I think is a bit of a problem if you are interested in demonstrating that plastics have accumulated in the brain. So errors are ubiquitous, and some errors never indeed do not affect the main conclusions of papers, but others certainly will. And I think there's this sentiment that I think magically science will self-correct. So in the long run, we will discover these errors and correct them, yeah, as I said, almost magically or sort of without us having to do anything about it. Just by the process of doing science, we will find and correct these errors. I don't think this is true. I don't think sometimes I don't. I mean, obviously, sometimes science is self-correcting. We do get better at certain things, and we revise methods. But sometimes we don't, I think. Sometimes this can last forever. Um, and also the question is what happens until it self-corrects, right? So even if that was true all the time, um, the errors are there until it self-corrects. And depending on how long this takes, the damage potential can be enormous. The immediate damage potential of this, for example, in the Reinhardt and Rogoff case, but there's also obviously opportunity costs. So as long as we believe in the wrong thing, we have no reason to assume it's wrong, I guess, and we won't pursue different answers. And so the potential damage of errors can be devastating, I think. Another problem is that publishing is another magical barrier, which I think is nicely expressed in Brandolini's law, which is like a version of basically saying that the bullshit symmetry principle, that it takes a magnitude order of magnitude more to correct an error than to say the wrong thing in the first place. And I think this is true in science as well. Once something has been published, the amount of work you have to invest in correcting the published record is astronomical, is larger than writing up the original work in the first place. Also, corrections propagate slowly. So sometimes we know something was an error and we can demonstrate it is an error. Sometimes we can even show it was fraudulent. But these corrections propagate very slowly by citations and practices. So even work that has been known to be wrong or fraudulent gets cited years or even decades later. Because how does this information get to you? It's not like you get a warning that something has been corrected. I know that software like Zotero plays around with this idea for retractions, but I think for retractions it might work better. But I think for like knowledge updating, this is obviously much more complicated. Another sentiment is that peer review will fix this. And I think this is asking too much of peer review. Surely peer review will catch some errors in manuscripts submitted to peer review, but it's not really designed to do this. I think peer review is more of a superficial plausibility check. So as long as something doesn't stick out as too weird or ignorant of the literature or does something that is just very different from the status quo, you will get past uh, many reviewers. Reviewers often also are not privy to the type of information you would need to correct or detect an error, right? It's not like reviewers routinely get sent data or code that they could look into if they were inclined to do so. So peer reviewers are not really different from readers of work after something has been published in many cases. And so expecting that they, just because they get to see the paper earlier, will likely catch these errors, I think it's just misplaced confidence. Also, peer review is usually a one-shot intervention, basically. So you do it once, and once you have passed the barrier, that's done. Things do not get peer reviewed again formally. Informally, of course, but we know that informal peer review, just basically reading the paper and citing it, doesn't necessarily lead to identifying errors as well. I think this is surprising because we know that peer review has low reliability and also, of course, knowledge evolves. And so the idea of re-reviewing is not that absurd, I think, but it's not happening on a larger scale. Peer review is also generally non-technical, so people will read the manuscript and give their impression of it, but that's it. And yeah, I think error checking is not really it's not really part of it. There's no expectation that reviewers will go and hunt for errors in papers they're assigned to. I think also this is surprising, given that we are in an industry that claims we are about discovering truth in the world, but there's very little checking, I think, formal checking of whether the path we take to discover this truth is actually good. This is the background why we came up with ERA, a bug bounty program for science. Bug bounty programs have existed in the technology industry for a long time and have been a great success there. So basically, in the technology industry, how it works is, if you're not familiar with the idea, tech companies will pay people cash bounties when they report an error in their work to the company. These are usually security or privacy errors, which are the greatest concern for most companies. They could also be functional errors. So let's say you discover that an important piece of software routinely deletes in files or information that would also be of interest to a tech company. But it's mostly around security and privacy. And if you report an important bug in a piece of software to a tech company using a standardized format, they will pay you a bounty, and the bounty scales with the importance of the error. So the more consequential that error is or could be, the greater the payout. And we thought this is a concept that could be applied to finding and rewarding finding errors in science. We have a very generous amount of funding for this, 250,000 francs that we can spend on these bug bounties. And our goal was or is to check something between 100 and 150 published articles. Obviously, the exact number is difficult to determine because, as I said, the payout scales with the magnitude of errors. So if we find more impactful errors, we can basically examine fewer papers. And if the errors are on average less important, then we have money for more just to examine more papers. In this program, we pay authors and reviewers a base fee for basically participating or doing the expected amount of work. And then there's a bonus reward that is contingent on the error found. This is the basic reward structure. I will show you a more detailed version of it in a minute. So the authors routinely get 250 francs as an incentive to participate. They too are expected to have to invest a little work in order to prepare the files, maybe communicate with the reviewer if they have follow-up questions and so on. And the authors get paid a bonus reward of up to 250 francs, which equals something between, I think, around 280 US dollars. I haven't looked up the recent exchange rates. Could be more than that, but let's say it's not more than 300 US dollars, I think. So they get paid up to 250 francs in case no errors or only very unimportant and few errors are found. For the reviewers, the pay is a lot more, obviously. So we, depending on the paper and the nature of the study or data they are supposed to look at, we estimate an effort they will have to invest in this and pay something between 250 and 1,000 francs just for doing the work and delivering a report. And then contingent on the importance and amount of errors they find, we pay them up to 2,500 francs bonus. So in theory, they could get a total of 3,500 for their work if they find devastating errors in a complex research. We will select candidate articles for their importance. We will usually pick articles that are have been published recently, which is within the last 10 years. And there's a pragmatic reason for this. I think data and code for papers older than 10 years are dramatically unlikely to still exist somewhere, and so we choose to not pursue those articles and go for more recent work. And I think, yeah, 10 years is not that recent, in fact. But yeah, so there's the pragmatic reason. And then the how do we know something is important? We do this, I think, a bit clumsily, but I haven't come up with a better way of picking highly cited work. In psychology, what does it mean to be highly cited? Basically, if you have more than 30 citations, that means you're in the top 2%. So that's not a lot of citations, I think, if you compare it to other fields. But the distribution of citations in psychology, I think the modal citation is one or something like that, or maybe two. Um, and then, so 30 citations will put you in the top 2%. And that's currently our cutoff, basically. We then obtain consent from the authors and request all materials. And this is a very important step because we want this to be a consensual process. We want the authors to be on board with this. Again, there's also a pragmatic rationale here. We need the authors anyway. The materials, especially the data and code, are unlikely to be available online somewhere. And so we can't really do this without the authors if the reviewers are expected to examine these materials. So I think it's sensible to obtain their consent and have them on board anyway. If we ever pick a highly cited paper that has all of these materials publicly available, we might consider skipping this step. But so far, it has shown to also smoothen the process a bit and make it less adversarial. Once we have consent from the office, we find a suitable reviewer. The reviewer gets invited, they get to send all of the materials, and then they're asked to write an error report, which they submit to us. The office get the opportunity to reply to this report, and then the so-called recommender, which is similar to an editor, I think, in a journal, makes a final decision. I prepared a slide with a few obvious questions that we'll go through now. Obviously, if you have more questions, please ask them at the end of this talk. So the most important question is what constitutes an error? And given the diversity of fields and methods and papers that we're looking at, I can only give you a very abstract general definition, and we define an error as an act that through ignorance, deficiency, or accident departs from or fails to achieve what should be done, which is a very broad definition, obviously. More importantly, who determines what constitutes an error? And it's not the reviewer. The reviewer writes the report, and obviously the reviewer can call anything they find an error, but in the end, it's the recommender that determines what constitutes an error. And this is necessary, obviously, because otherwise reviewers would be very much incentivized to call anything they see an error to increase their payout, where the recommender is someone from our team currently, although we also work with guest recommenders, will then take the report by the reviewer, the reply by the authors, and base their decision on that. Doesn't asking authors mean our sample is extremely biased? Yes, it does mean that. Obviously, there is a strong selection into participating in this program, and we have strong reason to believe that the authors not agreeing to participate in this are different and that their work is different from the authors that end up participating. It's something that in Germany is called alternativlos. So there's no sensible alternative, I think, here. We can't do this if we want to look at code and data. If we just look at the papers, obviously it would work, but I think the more interesting errors are usually found in those files, and we don't have them without the author's participation. Also, it means that it's biased, but it's biased in one direction, in the conservative direction, which means that if we do find substantial errors in the papers we examine in our sample, I think it's reasonable to conclude that more errors and more important errors would be found in the general literature of people not inclined to participate in something like this. Errors are categorized in two ways. We categorize whether the errors are important for the core conclusions of the paper, or whether they are basically only tangential or maybe not important at all, right? There's a difference between something that changes a major claim, let's say in the abstract or even title of the paper, and an error in the supplemental materials. And then there's the magnitude of the error. So how big is the mishap, basically independent of its importance for the core conclusions. And how much do we pay for errors? I already mentioned the bonus payout is up to 2,500 francs, and we have this categorization scheme. Basically, there's no errors at all. The author gets a bonus payout of 250 francs. In case of minor errors, which we expect is most research, there's still a bonus paid to the author and reviewer, because we do want to normalize the idea that minor errors will exist everywhere, basically. And as long as they don't really change the main conclusions, we don't really see this as a big problem. Then there's the category of indeterminable, which is many cases because of poor documentation. So sometimes let's say a particular finding cannot be reproduced by the reviewer, but we simply don't know why. So it's just unclear what the authors did originally, because maybe they don't have the code anymore, or maybe because the code is poorly documented, or maybe because the code is contradictory. And then we just don't know what happens. This is less desirable than verifiable minor errors, obviously. And in this case, it's just the reviewer that gets a bonus reward. And then there's basically a scale from moderate to severe. Moderate errors could end up in us recommending that a minor correction notice is issued. Major errors could lead to a major correction notice or warrant an expression of concern. And then severe errors, in our view, should lead to a retraction of the paper, and the reviewer gets paid up to 2,500 francs. We are not the journal, obviously. We're not in the business of actually issuing these corrections or retractions, but it's a recommendation that we will make to the authors. And obviously, irrespective of whether they pursue this or not, these amounts will be paid to the reviewer. So the reviewers will not have to wait for the retraction to happen to be paid fully to the degree that they find, for example, severe errors. What are the major goals of this program? Well, we are interested in the types of errors that exist in the literature, obviously. We know that we don't have a representative sample, so I'm not claiming that we can find their prevalence. But I think an empirical estimate will be obtained in the end, and that will be biased. That's true. But I think currently there's no estimate at all. And we don't really know what types of errors are being made currently. We are interested in exploring and testing the practical challenges in the implementation of such an error checking system, which currently does not exist. And we think something like this should exist. Doesn't have to be in the form of a bug bounty program, but some error checking system should exist in science, and we are testing this out. And I will get to that on my two slides further. We're interested in estimating a benefit cost ratio of an error detection system relative to not having these error detectors. And this obviously involves counterfactuals, because what is the cost of an error not being detected? It can be small, it can be huge. Basically, any PhD student starting their PhD based on an error from the previous literature will incur six-digit costs in the Western Hemisphere, and that would be a downstream cost of an error. But these are obviously involve counterfactuals. But we're interested in estimating this. We think funders should invest in this, and there's different angles that they could do this with. Funders too could obviously conduct audits of projects they have funded in the past. They could also grant offers grant people that they reward grants to a small portion of it they could give them to basically improve their own error checking capabilities. So maybe instead of only doing this post hoc, people awarded a grant could take a small cut from this and give it to someone to check their work before it's published. I think there's many different angles, but we think funders are the hold the lever here and also most likely to respond to this, given that it's in their interest to only fund research um, that is A, not based on errors, and B, doesn't involve errors itself. And then the more loftier sort of meta level goal is to create an error culture in science that is accepting of errors and of the idea that errors could exist and are not necessarily something that is embarrassing, just part of the normal human process of doing research. So where are we currently with errors? We have 6 completed reviews and 9 are pending, which is contrasted against 151 invitations we have sent. So the response rate is something like in the end 10%. And basically what happens is that roughly speaking, half of the invitations that we send out to authors that I never get a reply to. And so that's already 75 invitations out. Then of this half that is sending a reply, half of these, the reply is no, thank you. So that's another what, like, let's say 40 papers out. And then of those that do not say no, thank you, another half, for various reasons, ends up not participating. Maybe they do not have the data anymore. Maybe we also had people saying that they're currently up for tenure and they don't want potentially a report out at this time that says they committed an error, which I guess fair enough. Maybe they are the corresponding author and would like to participate, but they do not have the data. Someone else does, and they are not responsive. There's various reasons why people end up not participating in this. And so, yeah, in the end, about 10% approximately right now, that's the statistic, end up participating in this. All of the papers that we have examined so far had some error. But I think, if I recall correctly, only one had an error that changed a core conclusion, including a conclusion in the abstract that we felt should have been corrected. It has not been corrected yet, and I'm not expecting that it will be corrected right now. But yeah, that's what we have so far, and something like 9,000 francs in payouts so far. What are the key challenges so far? Well, convincing authors, I think that's an obvious one that was also expected. Convincing authors to participate in this is it's difficult. Obviously, not always. Some authors are very welcoming of this idea, but many are skeptical. And I get it, because they're basically exposing their work to risk. Obviously, if their work proves to be error-free, that's great. They get a nice report saying as much, but it is risk for authors that they have to take, and they would have to be very principled to accept this risk for the benefit of science, basically. What has been a less expected challenge is convincing reviewers. I understand that there is a peer review crisis, so we are not the only ones that are facing this problem, but we have money, and I thought this would help. This also translates into another challenge. We're being ghosted by reviewers a lot. So people sign on initially, and then they never send the report. And again, we thought the peer review crisis, and I think this is also a common sentiment, that it's basically reviews are not being rewarded by anyone, but we do reward them. And we thought throwing money at this would fix it, but it doesn't. There has recently been a not very favorable press coverage in this in the science news section, where the headline is offering scientists cash to spot errors in published research doesn't work. I think this is a bit unfair, a bit of an unfair headline because I think it's too soon to tell. I think it's fair to say it doesn't work as well as we expected it would. But I mean, the point of error is to explore when and how it could work. And I still believe in the general principle of bug bounty programs. Maybe the way we have set it up currently with consent-based and very sort of and consent and invitation-based doesn't work. And it's also different from the tech industry where anyone can submit an error, a bug bounty. But we'll see. I think, but it is not as easy as we thought it would be. We also discovered that we accidentally kind of founded a journal. So we're basically doing a lot of the things that a journal does as well. We're trying to embrace this discovery by currently thinking about launching a journal as an additional incentive for reviewers where they can formally publish their reviewer, their error report as an additional incentive of something that they produce and that has sort of academic value for their CV. This is the team. I invite you to visit the website if you haven't done this already. And yeah, thanks.